Alright, welcome to the next part in my lecture on pre-Columbian civilizations and how they developed and how they fell. Originally I was going to make this a three-part lecture, but the last part seems a bit long, so I'm going to break it up into two more parts. And this time, I'm going to discuss how the Aztec Empire was conquered by the Spanish. And I'll begin with a bit of European context. Beginning in 1500, Europe began a wave of exploration and colonization, spurred on by a desire for wealth and expanding their empires. Technological advancements and breakthroughs in exploration would help to facilitate this, specifically the discovery of a route around Africa and the discovery of the Americas. And from the Spanish perspective, in particular, after the Treaty of Tordesillas, which granted pretty much all of the Americas to Spain, while granting pretty much the rest of the world to Portugal, Spain began to focus its colonization efforts on the Americas, beginning with the Caribbean islands of Hispaniola and Cuba. The Spanish would eventually begin to, venture out onto the American mainland in Mexico, and Hernan Cortez would be an instrumental figure in this effort. And Hernan Cortez was a wealthy landowner who had been living in Spanish-occupied territory in the Caribbean, starting off in Hispaniola, then later helping Diego Vasquez conquer Cuba in 1511. In 1518, however, Cortez began to organize a trip to the American mainland, and by February of 1519, he had an expedition of 11 ships, over 600 men, and 16 horses. And when Cortez landed, he actually began to ally himself with some of the local tribes. And this ties back to a bit of what I discussed in the last lecture about how the Aztecs grew their empire, which was they essentially did it by conquering a whole bunch of the smaller tribes and peoples that inhabited Mesoamerica. And so by this time, the Aztec Empire was essentially made up of a whole bunch of these smaller cultures that all had their own identity, separate from the Aztec Empire. And what this allowed Cortez to do was to gather anti-Aztec sentiment in these, separate cultures, and, convince them to maybe help him shake up the power structure and maybe overthrow the Aztecs. And he began by, allying himself with the Totonac people near the coast, but a more significant development would come when he moved further inland and encountered the Tlaxcala people, which was a very powerful, group of people who were actually independent from the Aztec Empire, though they were, very much under the Aztec influence. And so Cortez actually, after, a bit of conflict, did convince them to become allies, and the Tlaxcala would eventually end up supplying Cortez with several thousand troops that would accompany the Spanish deeper into Mexico. And as Cortez continued, he would arrive at the city of Cholula, where he actually massacred a great many of its inhabitants under the suspicion that they were planning an ambush, even though this was, a completely false notion. And, despite, all of this, gaining allies against the Aztecs and this massacre, when Cortez arrived in Tenochtitlan, things were actually peaceful at first. Neither side instigated conflict. And this was actually largely due to Moctezuma, the current Aztec leader, great indecisiveness on Moctezuma's part. And actually a lot of Moctezuma's advisors were telling him, you've got to get rid of these Spanish guys, they're bad news. But Moctezuma was just essentially paralyzed by indecision. And this would eventually lead to granting the Spanish an opening, and they would perform a coup against Moctezuma and eventually end up executing him. Even after Moctezuma's execution, however, conflict did not begin immediately. It was only actually after a second Spanish expedition sent by one of Cortez's rivals, the current governor of Cuba, arrived on the Mexican coast, and Cortez took the majority of his forces to go and expel them. That the commander, in Cortez's stead, who stayed in Tenochtitlan, Pedro de Alvarado, authorized a massacre of Aztecs participating in a religious festival, which was, that was the last straw, and all-out war between the Spanish and the Aztec broke out. And at first, the Spanish were completely driven out of Tenochtitlan and significantly weakened, though they were actually able to retreat to their Tlaxcala allies' territory, where they would resupply and rest up. And Cortez would end up marching on Tenochtitlan again, and after a 90-day siege, Tenochtitlan would fall on August 13th, 1521. And there are a whole bunch of factors contributing to this, the fall of the Aztecs in this way. And, one undeniable consideration is the differential in the advancement of both of these civilizations. The factors mentioned earlier in this lecture, in the first part, that led to European colonization having an advantage from the jump, that superior geography and more domesticable animals and crops that I mentioned, gave the Spanish a huge head start in the civilization game and allowed them to, develop far superior technology. But another, kind of side effect of all of those animals that the Europeans were able to domesticate and farm was that it generated a whole bunch of diseases. And it did this by, if you've got a bunch of livestock in a tight area, they're going to be passing diseases back and forth like crazy, which means that those diseases are going to mutate, and eventually they're going to be able to make the jump from those animals to the human population. And then you've got a similar situation where you've got all these people in, civilized urban environments all close together. They pass diseases all over the place. And, eventually they gain at least some degree of immunity to those diseases. But, when they arrive in the Americas, the Native Americans, first of all, they didn't really have any livestock to speak of their own, so they didn't really have that, disease-producing engine that the Europeans did, so they didn't pass any diseases of their own back to the Europeans, but they also had zero immunity to the diseases that were coming from Europe, so these diseases just, wiped through them, absolutely devastating. And, these factors, they weren't the only thing, so you have to consider, social and psychological factors as well. And actually, a common framing for this event portrays Cortez as, some kind of cunning leader who, with his well-armed Spanish troops, outmaneuvered the Aztec with some help from European diseases. This narrative actually also often involves tropes around how native people saw European invaders, such as the idea that Aztecs originally thought Cortez was some kind of returning god. This idea may not be entirely accurate, however, and it most likely leans heavily on incorrect assumptions about the intelligence and inferiority of the Aztec and Native Americans in general. And it's also been put forward that this idealized Cortez is just it's kind of ridiculous. He was in no way a military mastermind, and his supposed tactical genius really had no effect on the outcome of this conflict. And the decisiveness of the Spanish victory is also often overblown. This conflict lasted around 2 years, so it wasn't like a instantaneous wipeout of the Aztec forces. And also the effect superior Spanish technology had is often overblown. There's just no way. Even though that admittedly Spanish technology was far better than Aztecs, there was just so many Aztecs compared to the Spanish forces that it's just not realistic to expect it to have that much of a difference. And it's likely that the Spanish victory had far more to do with the vast amount of native forces that agreed to help the Spanish. Those Tlaxcala people I mentioned earlier. And these forces, I mean, allies, eventually amassed to around 200,000 by the time the Aztecs fell. Which, I mean, that's just undeniable. That's absolutely massive. And also, the Aztecs actually were put at a disadvantage by their differing culture around war. With the Aztec customs often, involve seeking face-to-face combat as opposed to guerrilla tactics, and they also had a strong desire to take prisoners, um, you know, often to perform human sacrifice. And so this would hamper their combat effectiveness since they had this more, culturally ingrained, I don't know, I suppose more ritualistic approach to combat, which the Spanish, they did not share that at all. They were totally okay with guerrilla tactics and just absolutely brutal and, what could be seen as like cowardly tactics that would just, decimate the Aztecs. And, this approach to combat by the Aztecs would actually be portrayed as, inhumane and barbaric by the invaders. Even though their tactics, produced far more suffering through unthinking slaughter and, brutal siege tactics. For example, and during that 90-day siege I mentioned, they cut off food supplies to Tenochtitlan, which, resulted in terrible famine. But, human sacrifice, I guess, was really good PR for the Spanish. They could really spin that against the Aztecs. And, yeah, that's where I'm going to leave it off. That's how the Spanish conquered the Aztec Empire and some of the reasons for how it went down, how it did. And next time, I'm going to talk about how the Incan Empire met a very similar fate to the Aztecs.